Lesson 10, the heart of Ajax, the XMLHTTPRequest object. In this lesson, you will learn how to create an instance of the XMLHTTPRequest object regardless of which browser your user may have. The object's properties and methods will be introduced. This chapter examines the object at the heart of every Ajax application, the XMLHTTPRequest object. The topics we will cover in Lesson 10 are introducing XMLHTTPRequest and creating the XMLHTTPRequest object. XMLHTTPRequest is supported by virtually all modern browsers, including Microsoft's Internet Explorer 5+ and a variety of non-Microsoft browsers, including Mozilla, Firefox, Conqueror, Opera, and Safari, and is supported on a wide range of platforms, including Microsoft Windows, Unix, Linux, and Mac OS X. The purpose of the XMLHTTPRequest object is to allow JavaScript to formulate HTTP requests and submit them to the server. Traditionally programmed web applications normally make such requests synchronously in conjunction with a user-initiated event such as clicking on a link or submitting a form, resulting in a new or updated page being served to the browser. Using XMLHTTPRequest, however, you can have your page make such calls asynchronously in the background, allowing you to continue using the page without the interruption of a browser refresh and the loading of a new or revised page. This capability underpins all Ajax applications, making the XMLHTTPRequest object the key to Ajax programming. You cannot make use of the XMLHTTPRequest until you have created an instance of it. Creating an instance of an object in JavaScript is usually just a matter of making a call to a method known as the object's constructor. In the case of XMLHTTPRequest, however, you must change this routine a little to cater for the peculiarities of different browsers, as you see in the following section. Microsoft first introduced the XMLHTTPRequest object, implementing it in Internet Explorer 5 as an ActiveX object. Most other browser developers have now included into their products an equivalent object, but implemented as a native object in the browser's JavaScript interpreter. Because you don't know in advance which browser, version, or operating system your users will have, your code must adapt its behavior on the fly to ensure that the instance of the object will be created successfully. For the majority of browsers that support XMLHTTPRequest as a native object, Mozilla, Opera, and the rest, creating an instance of this object is straightforward. This line creates an XMLHTTPRequest object called request. Here we have declared a variable request and assigned to it the value returned from the statement new XMLHTTPRequest, which is invoking the constructor method for the XMLHTTPRequest object. To achieve the equivalent result in Microsoft Internet Explorer, you will need to create an ActiveX object. Here's an example. Once again, this assigns the name request to the new object. To complicate matters a little more, some versions of Internet Explorer have a different version of MS-XML, the Microsoft XML parser, installed. In those cases, you need to use this instruction. You will need to create a script that will correctly create an instance of an XMLHTTPRequest object, regardless of which browser you are using, provided, of course, that the browser supports XMLHTTPRequest. A good solution to this problem is to have your script try and turn each method of creating an instance of the object until one of the methods succeeds. Have a look at this example in which this strategy is used. This uses the JavaScript statements try and catch. The try statement allows us to attempt to run a piece of code. If the code runs without errors, all is well. However, should an error occur, we can use the catch statement to intervene before an error message is sent to the user and determine what the program should then do about the error. An alternative and equally valid technique would be to detect which type of browser is in use by testing which objects are defined in the browser. This example shows this technique. In this example, we've used this test to determine whether XMLHTTPRequest is a native object of the browser in use. If so, we use the constructor method to create an instance of the XMLHTTPRequest object. Otherwise, we try creating a suitable ActiveX object as we did in the first example. Whatever method you use to create an instance of the XMLHTTPRequest object, you should be able to call this function like this. Now that we have created an instance of the XMLHTTPRequest object, let's look at some of the object's properties and methods shown here. In future lessons, we'll examine how these methods and properties are used to create the functions that form the building blocks of AJAX applications. For now, let's examine just a few of these methods. The open method prepares the XMLHTTPRequest object to communicate with the server. You need to supply at least the 2 mandatory arguments to this method. First, specify which HTTP method you intend to use, usually GET or POST. Next, the destination URL of the request is included as the second argument. If making a GET request, this URL needs to be suitably encoded with any parameters and their values as part of the URL. For security reasons, the XMLHTTPRequest object is allowed to communicate only with URLs within its own domain. An attempt to connect to a remote domain results in a permission denied error message. Optionally, you may want to include a third argument to the send request, a Boolean value to declare whether the request is being sent in asynchronous mode. If set to false, the request will not be sent in asynchronous mode, and the page will be effectively locked until the request is completed. The default value of true will be assumed if the parameter is omitted, and requests will then be sent asynchronously. Having prepared the XMLHTTP request using the open method, you can send the request using the send method. One argument is accepted by the send function. If your request is a GET request, the request information will be encoded into the destination URL, and you can then simply invoke the send method using the argument. However, if you are making a POST request, the content of the request, suitably encoded, will be passed as the argument. In this case, we use the setRequestHeader method to indicate what type of content we are including. This lesson introduced the XMLHTTPRequest object, the driving force behind any AJAX application, and illustrated how an instance of such an object is created both for Internet Explorer and for other non-Microsoft browsers. We also briefly examined some of the object's properties and methods. You can now test your knowledge in the quiz area, access the scripts we learned in the lab, or go through the lesson again. The choice is yours. Thank you for choosing Sam's Teacher